SAA says it will apply a no work, no pay policy for its striking employees. The carrier has been forced to cancel domestic and international flights until either Sunday or Monday. Negotiations with unions will continue on Saturday. Well, let's discuss some of the demands that they've raised. I'm joined by specialists. That has been raised by the unions around consultation. They say that SAA at no point informed them, at least officially, about these negotiations. COSATU seems to also believe the story that the unions have put forth because they've raised questions about the process too. Whatever you're dealing with might result in job losses.
Good evening, thanks.
Sure.
Kathy, consultation is the key. It's a prerequisite for any retrenchment under the Labour Relations Act. So it's unimaginable that an employer intending to dismiss potentially 1,000 employees would start the process without having to go through a consultation process. So what the law requires is the following, is that at the point at which SAA would have contemplated dismissing some of its employees because of its financial constraints, unions whose members may be affected, which would include NUMSA and the cabin crew union, it must set out in that notice the reasons for contemplating the retrenchments, the number of people that it intends to retrench, the timing, the alternatives that it has considered. All of those are listed in Section 189.3 of the LRA. So I would imagine that for an organization as big as SAA, that a notice to that effect would probably have been issued. What the unions may be taking issue with is the fact that notwithstanding the issuing of the notice, they are not happy with the rationale or the reason given by SAA for wanting to retrench those employees.
Let's talk about and the unions had reached some kind of deadlock behind the scenes as far as those salary negotiations were concerned. And of course, SAA offering a 5.9% increase. The unions are adamant they want 8%. And before that stalemate is given some kind of reprieve or way forward, there's then the announcement of employer's perspective as far as SAA then having to explain itself further, especially in a process like the CCMA?
It complicates the process, and I think we have to keep in mind that these are two distinct and separate processes. So what would have happened with the wage demands is that there would have been negotiations before the strike was called. Those negotiations would have deadlocked. The unions would have had to refer a dispute to the CCMA. It's a prerequisite for any protected strike. And once the CCMA issued a certificate, or 30 days after the referral, then the unions would have been entitled to issue a strike notice, which is what apparently they did. But it appears that we actually are contemplating reducing the workforce in order to deal with our financial constraints. Now, the question is, chicken and egg, which process comes first? The wage negotiations were already underway, a certificate had already been issued, and that is, Kathy, the reason for the strike. As I understand it, the strike is not related to the actual retrenchments, because if that were the case, that strike would be unprotected, because there is a different process that must be followed in relation to the retrenchments, insofar as the unions may want to strike over those. But the CCMA's role in all of this, of course, is to try and mediate, conciliate, and try and bring the parties together. And obviously that failed, because otherwise we wouldn't have had a certificate issued and a strike notice. The mediation, because the law allows for the CCMA to intervene even after that.
Given the fact that both these processes, as you've highlighted, are happening at the same time, or now have to happen at the same time, the CCMA will handle the wage negotiations. But You spoke about the reasoning that employers must provide when entering, whether it is a notice for retrenchments or even being able to justify why they are not able to meet the wage demands of the unions. How much attention is paid what the unions have to say about where they believe CMA give?
His hands are tied because it can't really say to the unions that your demand is unreasonable. All it can do is to try and say, well, can we try and bring the parties together? And if it can't, the unions have the right to continue with their strike. Whereas with the retrenchments, even though it cannot make an agreement for the parties, the employer, the SAA in this case, does have to provide solid reasons why these retrenchments are not avoidable. Because the matter goes to the labor court, for example, then the labor court will examine each and every reason that the SSA gives. It will consider whether there were alternatives, like you say. Could other costs other than employment costs have been reduced? Or even if it's employment costs, for example, could allowances or overtime or something else, could it have been reduced? So those will be looked at if the matter does go to the labor court. But I do need to say this, that it doesn't have to go to the labor court. Now, even if there's no agreement on the retrenchments after the CCMA has intervened, the law does allow the unions, because this is a so-called mass retrenchment under 189A of the LRA, to actually strike over the retrenchments instead of going to the labor court to challenge the reasoning behind the retrenchments.
What counts as a solid reason? So at least this is your line of work. What is generally acceptable as a reason for having to let people go?
Kathy, there are a myriad of reasons, but essentially what it boils down to is this. The employer, it doesn't have to show been accepted in the past that an employer could potentially retrench even if it's not losing money. But in this instance, for example, if the SAA were to say the reason is primarily financial and it can justify that by reference to its financial statements, then that is a reason that potentially the court would accept as a justifiable reason. But the issue will be, of course, were there other alternatives that could have been considered?
I wonder then, what are the rights of workers in a scenario such as this? We find ourselves in the country where we're going through a tough economic time, and chances are this is just one but many stories of retrenchments that we've had in multiple sectors. So is there anything that employees can do to try and hang on to those jobs, particularly from the position of the unions? Because, of course, they're going to tell employees that we're going to do everything we can to protect your jobs. But is that a realistic position to take?
Unions are in a difficult position right now. I mean, like you say, for example, there's been a report recently that there might be retrenchments in the steel industry in Saldanha, but 1,000 workers are also supposedly at risk of being retrenched. And I suspect that it being steel, NUMSA
and it
would be one
it affects the same union.
And NUMSA is a very seasoned union. It's been around for a long time and it's done quite well, I think one could say. What can it do? Not that much, because what it's really faced with is one, trying to convince the employers not to retrench. And for that, the employers will always demand in return, for example, that, agree to a wage freeze, for example. That's one way of avoiding the retrenchments. We can't give your members a salary increase while front a lot of employers and create a difficult situation for the unions, because the members and 5% perhaps, but if the employer says, but I'm actually contemplating retrenchment because I can't operationally continue without reducing costs, the union has to think about protecting the jobs whilst maintaining a reasonable standard of living for its members. It becomes a very difficult position in which the union finds itself, because if it insists on getting a big salary increase, the employer says, fine, I will, but then I'm going to retrench 1,800 workers afterwards.
As far as then being able to delay the process, even if it does mean, it's delaying the inevitable, how much time do people generally have from the time that an employee, as SAA has done, sends out notice to say, well, this is what we're planning to do, versus when it actually then acts and fully goes through the process?
Right. What will happen in a case like this, as I said, is that the CCMA must appoint a act of requesting the CCMA to appoint a facilitator is effectively to buy a 60-day period from the day that the notice is issued before the employer can issue a notice to say, I am retrenching you. And during that period, the facilitator will attempt to get the parties to agree either on avoiding the retrenchments altogether or at least reducing the number of employees.
And if the unions don't want a facilitator employed and they completely stay out of any kind of negotiations, what are the probabilities there?
Well, if they don't, unfortunately, from a timing point of view, the employer would then be entitled to issue a notice 30 days after issuing the Section 189.3 notice. But in return, the unions are entitled to issue a strike notice. So in that event, is SAA will say, well, I'm retrenching, and the unions will say, we're going on strike. The danger, of course, of not participating in the process, Kathy, is that if you do go to the labor court instead of persisting with a strike, then the court is not going to look kindly at you as a party who refused to take part in the process.
All right. Well, thank you so much. All of these processes to us as simply as you have Puke Maserumule, he's a lawyer and labor analyst. So those are just some of the scenarios and how they could play themselves out, particularly where the SAA matter is concerned. Of course, the airline continuing then to suspend all of its flights. They're asking some of their partners from other airlines to assist them, especially where the already scheduled international flights are concerned. So after the break, then we'll bring you the latest headlines. We also speak to the Board of Airline Representatives of South Africa. They'll be talking about tourism and how it's